Why not start with the topic of the day, which is the so-called deal with Iran? Have you received any particular briefing on this, or are you like us watching TV and seeing what happens?
I'm watching TV, no brief. Now, if the president wants to declare victory, that may be, frankly, for our country and the world, the best thing. But I don't think this agreement will stand up to the test of time. Remember, the president went in without asking the Congress, without asking the American people. He had noble goals. Let's get a better regime, get rid of the Iranian nuclear capabilities, get rid of the missiles, sink their navy. We've not done any of that. The regime now is worse because of more extreme. This pathway to getting rid of their nuclear enriched uranium. I think the Iranians have been masters at manipulating this for years, and I think they can out-negotiate our negotiators who don't even have background. Clearly, they still have their missile capability. And while the strait may be reopened, the whole idea that at any point Iran, because they've got literally 500 or 600 of these little speedboats that can mine the strait or mine tankers at any time, I don't see how anyone, even in Trumplandia, can say America and our allies are better off after this 107-day war of choice.
Yeah, so we are of one mind on that. A phrase comes to mind that I've used often in my FBI career. Our situation has not improved. I don't think, that opening the strait, which was open before the war.
Yes, sir.
Having a hardline regime, which we had before the war, having them preserve status quo with their nukes, allegedly, and promise not to move forward with a nuclear program, is any better than we had. And yeah, I think Americans are going to see through this.
Frank, you brought one last thing, though.
Yeah.
It has already taken roughly $60 billion out of American pockets on increased gas prices. That doesn't count the increased airline prices, the fertilizer prices.
Right.
And my kind of one of the wild things that energy experts says, because we have depleted all of our worldwide reserves so far down, at some point, the reality of that, even though the strait may reopen, I don't know whether basic supply and demand, maybe not in our country, but around the world, is not going to hit a tipping point in July.
That's what they're saying, end of July, early August. And that's where I thought Iran's leverage point would be optimal. So we'll see if they really sign off on this. The return on investment's not there. What are you hearing about releasing frozen Iranian assets back to them?
I think that will be the great irony, because remember, Obama got lambasted under the JCPOA, where we actually did have eyes on the Iranian assets, and we had Russia and China part of our alliance. I cannot imagine any path forward where Iran doesn't get some resources released. Now, how the president will explain that, I don't know. And he will say this is Iranian caught resources, the same thing that Obama used. But there will be resources going to the regime. And, on top of that, remember, during this war, the Trump Treasury Department actually released the sanctions on Iranian oil that was at sea. So we've already been shoveling them about $14 billion. And then on top of that, because of our relief on the Russian oil, I still am a little old school. I still think we should support the Ukrainians. Putin's gotten another 12 to 15 billion, depending on how you cut it. So I don't know how Iran will not come out with additional cash that they would not have had prior to the beginning of this war in late February.
My guest last week was Jim Himes, and I'm sure you work along with Jim, and he used the phrase, Iran is in the strategic catbird seat. They can make Trump look even worse than he already does with anything they do at this point.
Yes, sir. And, and it also, we've had this tenuous agreement with our Gulf allies. Now there are questions whether we're going to stay. I get so frustrated. One thing I do agree with Donald Trump on, which is rare, but my frustration with Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government. I am, very supportive of Israel's right to defend itself, but the continuing bombing of southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
I do not know how this will play out. And the fact that this is still held so close, at some point, these facts are going to come out. The American people are going to know, we in Congress and the rest of the world are going to know. And even in Trumpian world, as up is down and down is up, how you explain this as a win, I think even the master manipulator, Mr. Trump, will have a hard time making that case.
Yeah, you went there. I was going to go there next, and that is Israel and Netanyahu. And like you, yes, of course, I support Israel's right to exist and to defend itself, but not necessarily to dictate our foreign policy and future. And so the latest I heard this morning, and again, we're both going off news reports, is Israel may not play on this deal. They may go off on their own. And I think Trump's objectives and Netanyahu's have clearly diverged. It's in Netanyahu's best interest to keep going, and it's in, for face-saving purposes, it's in Trump's best interest to stop.
And as you know, Frank, Netanyahu has his own political history catching up with him. He's under, indictment by the Israeli justice system. His only path is to try to maintain the far right coalition he has. And, I don't think this is going to end well. And, I've constantly been disappointed by the Lebanese government inability to disarm Hezbollah. But on the other hand, simply bombing to smithereens all of southern Lebanon takes people, the Christian communities, the Druze communities, even some of the other Sunni communities that might be ready to be done with the Shia Hezbollah, but it takes them off the board because of Israel's overly aggressive activity. So, in
that vein, and with your role on Senate intelligence, where do you fall on this idea that this had to happen because Iran was weeks away from being able to build a nuclear weapon? Where do you come down on that?
Categorically false.
Yeah.
Absolutely false. There was no imminent threat.
Yeah.
Even the person who was then director of national intelligence, who's resigning, Tulsi Gabbard, who I have huge issues with, acknowledged that there was no imminent threat. Yeah. There was both as you know, Frank, this was your business, there's the enrichment part, but then there's also the delivery mechanism and a host of other things we can't talk about here.
Right.
And again, let me make clear, the Iranian regime has been, and will be awful to the region, awful to their people. Yeah. Ironically, if in early January, when the Iranian people literally were rising up, and I think north of 30,000 were killed, I'm still not sure that would have been the time, but at least if he tried to intervene then, it might have tipped the regime. He couldn't, because the forces we were supposed to have in the region at that point, the USS Ford, which was deployed from my state in Norfolk, and the carrier group was off the coast of Venezuela on his other expedition against Maduro. So, and then the idea that if we're at this point now, in a normal course, if we're going to say we're going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the way to do this would be to say we're going to have an international armada of our European friends, others, but none of our traditional friends want to get on board because of his efforts towards Greenland and his, kind of zigging and zagging all over the place. Exactly. And again, at the end of the day, we are stronger with allies and friends. The Russians, Chinese, Iranians don't have those. We have them, but we have burnt so many of them. It's just...
Yeah, for sure. My whole FBI career has been, a story of succeeding with friends and having friends who have your back, and that's very true in the intelligence world. And I'm very concerned about that loss of friendship. We were, neither one of us can go into detail, but with both of our backgrounds, it seemed we were doing pretty darn well with suppressing Iran's nuclear program. It seemed to me, certain Iranian scientists had very short shelf lives, and things were happening.
And we had, and JCPOA was not perfect, the Obama agreement, but we actually had Russia and China as part of the enforcers. We did have eyes on. Yeah. And anyway, we are where we are.
Yeah.
And frankly, if the president I'm not going to bemoan if the president wants to declare victory.
No.
It's not a victory, but at least maybe is a way for us to extract, because continuation of this non-thought through policy would be also a mistake.